Okay, this is the digestive system. And the digestive system is going to serve three main roles for the body. And one is to break down food into nutrient molecules. So if you imagine, for example, taking a bite of apple, that's going to be way too big to be able to cross the cell lining of the small intestine and get into the bloodstream. So all of the processes that happen between the mouth and the small intestine are getting the food broken down into molecules like carbohydrates that can be absorbed. The next job is absorption of those nutrient molecules into the bloodstream, which means that the molecules are actually crossing the cell lining and being absorbed into the cardiovascular system. And then finally, whatever can't be absorbed, because it couldn't be broken down into small enough molecules, for example, cellulose, which we call fiber, we don't have enzymes for to digest, and so they are not broken down into small enough molecules that can be absorbed. They ended up being eliminated as indigestible remains. Indigestible remains is super fancy for feces or poop. Now, the digestive system includes the alimentary canal as well as accessory organs. This bullet should be out here. The alimentary canal is the scientific name for the tube that runs through you. It is also known as the gastrointestinal tract. And along that pathway, we are going to digest, which is the act of breaking down food either mechanically or chemically, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Absorb, the crossing of nutrient molecules into the bloodstream. And eliminate whatever we couldn't digest. And in the average person, the alimentary canal is about 9 meters long. And of course, there's about 3 feet per meter, so that makes it about 27 feet in length. Kind of hard to imagine that there's that much tube running through you. However, most of that tube is the small intestine, which is highly coiled inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. The other part of the digestive system are the accessory organs. These are going to be structures that are not a part of the tube itself, but still have some role in digestion in the body. Examples include the liver, which makes bile, the pancreas, which makes digestive juices, etc. So we'll mention those as we go, and they will aid in mechanical and chemical digestion. Figure 24.1 shows us the major structures of the digestive system. The oral cavity is the official entrance for food into the digestive system. Food is then going to pass into the pharynx or throat, then enter the esophagus, which passes through the thorax, through the diaphragm, and leads food into the stomach. The stomach leads food into the small intestine, which is where most of that 27 feet is, very highly coiled in the abdomen, and from the small intestine into the large intestine. Large intestine is going to move fecal matter to the external environment at the anus. Accessory structures are going to include structures like the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, which is down here underneath the stomach, that are structures that will contribute to digestion. Also, the salivary glands will contribute saliva to the tract, but they aren't actually a part of the tube itself. Now, digestive processes start with ingestion, which is the act of actually putting food into the mouth, which is something that only animals on the planet do, and of course humans are classified as an animal. Plants photosynthesize, and fungi and bacteria absorb nutrients directly from their environment across into their cells. So it's just animals that ingest. Once we have the food in the oral cavity, we need to propel it. That will begin with voluntary swallowing. And of course, that's done with skeletal muscle. And we'll cover this in more detail later. And we'll continue through the alimentary canal with involuntary peristalsis, which we learned back in the muscle chapter, which was the alternating contractions of the inner circular and outer longitudinal layers of smooth muscle in hollow organs. We will also begin mechanical digestion. Mechanical digestion starts with chewing, using the teeth in the mouth, continues with churning, which is a special type of squeezing action in the stomach, and segmentation, which is a special type of squeezing action in the small intestines itself. We will also chemically digest along the way, using things like enzymes and acids, such as in the stomach, to chemically break down bonds of food molecules so that we can get to a size that can cross the intestinal lining for absorption. Those molecules will be absorbed into the bloodstream. And again, whatever we could not absorb will be removed as indigestible foodstuff in a process known as elimination. And elimination involves the movement of feces from the body, which is also known as defecation. This figure is not in your text, so it'll be provided for you in the ink. And it's a nice figure because it shows you where all of the digestive processes occur along the alimentary canal. Ingestion begins at the oral cavity or the mouth. Then we're going to have to propel. We will begin propulsion with voluntary swallowing into the esophagus. And then from the esophagus all the way to the end of the canal is going to be involuntary peristalsis. Along the way, we will mechanically digest, including chewing beginning at the mouth, churning in the stomach, and segmentation in the small intestine. We will also chemically digest, and there's one missing thing in this diagram. Chemical digestion actually begins in the mouth with saliva. In fact, there's a fun little activity that you can do at home, especially if you have young children. They'll enjoy doing this, to prove that chemical digestion begins in the mouth. What you would do is simply take 2 Dixie cups, 2 little paper cups, fill one of those cups up with water and the other cup up with spit. That's where the young children comes in. They'll enjoy filling that cup up with spit. And then what you do is take 2 small pieces of white bread. It has to be white bread because white bread is made of simple sugars that we can digest. Wheat bread is mostly made of fiber, which we do not digest. But you put a small, maybe 1 inch by 1 inch square piece of bread in each cup. Let it sit there for about an hour. Come back, and an hour later, the bread in the water will be a soggy piece of bread. The bread in the spit will pretty much be gone because there are enzymes called amylase in the saliva, which we'll talk about later in the chapter, that break down those simple sugars and will actually chemically digest down that bread. We continue chemical digestion in the stomach with acids and enzymes. We even continue chemical digestion in the small intestine itself. Nutrient molecules that are digested down small enough for absorption will cross the cell lining and go into the bloodstream, as well as into the lymphatic vessels. This is going to happen with lipid, as we'll describe later in the chapter. And then whatever we cannot absorb is going to be eliminated through a process called defecation. This figure is also not in your text, but it's a nice figure that shows the difference between peristalsis and segmentation. The figure on the left, figure A, shows us peristalsis, whereas the figure on the right, figure B, shows us segmentation. Now, both activities are performed by smooth muscle, but for 2 different purposes. Okay. We'll start with peristalsis. Peristalsis is a wave-like contraction that will continue to move food forward through the tract and never in reverse. So it's moving the forward from the esophagus down through the rest of the alimentary canal. So this is a form of propulsion. However, segmentation, which only happens in the small intestine, is a rhythmic back and forth type of mechanical digestion. So as the food is propelled by peristalsis into the small intestine, the peristaltic wave will stop, and the smooth muscle of the small intestine will do rhythmic back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth contractions that literally pulverizes the food into smaller and smaller molecules while it's sitting in the small intestine. So peristalsis is for movement. Segmentation is a form of physically breaking down the food, mechanical digestion. Now the peritoneum, this is something that we introduced way back in the beginning of the semester. We had the pleural cavity, the peritoneal cavity, and the pericardial cavities lined with serous membranes. Those serous membranes had 2 layers. So if you don't remember this, you should probably go back and review it from chapter 1. where the first layer lined the cavity wall, eventually dipped in and lined the organ in the cavity, came back and lined the rest of the cavity wall. The cavity wall lining was the parietal layer. The layer on the organ was the visceral layer of that serous membrane. So we'll be working with the parietal and visceral peritoneum, and we'll dissect and identify those in the laboratory as well for this chapter. The peritoneal cavity is actually the space between the two layers of membrane, and it fills with serous fluid. And of course, serous fluid reduces friction of the movement of the organs that are within the cavity. We'll also see two additional kinds of membranes called omenta and mesentery. Now, mesentery is a double serous membrane that is going to tether organs to the body wall, whereas the omenta is going to tether organs to each other. Okay, so for example, if we have a cavity wall, and we'll put some organs in here, and no, our organs don't look like these geometrical shapes, but we're just explaining a concept. Mesentery is going to attach the organ to the body wall, whereas omenta is going to attach one organ to another organ, like that. Okay, so let's get some labels on here. This would be mesentery. This is omenta. We'll see an example of omenta when we get to the stomach later in the chapter as well. Now, some organs are retroperitoneal and some organs are intraperitoneal. Which of these two do you think means behind the peritoneal membrane structure? Yeah, retro. Retro means like in the past or behind. Intra means within. And so these are going to be structures that are within the peritoneal membrane. So we draw a cavity, and again, we'll put some organs in here that do not represent the shape of our organs, but we're going to go with it like that. Some of these organs will be lined by the peritoneal membrane. So for example, the membrane would come away from the body and line the organs. Like that. And you have your parietal layer and your visceral layer. Okay. Now those organs are within the membranous structure. So all of those are intraperitoneal organs. Now these two organs are not lined by the peritoneal membrane, so they are retroperitoneal organs. So as we go through not only the digestive system, but also the urinary system and the reproductive system, we will see some organs that are intraperitoneal and some that are retroperitoneal. Examples in this system include the liver and the stomach are retroperitoneal, but most of the intestine is intraperitoneal. Now, anywhere you slice it along the alimentary canal, you're going to have the same four basic layers. Mucosa will always line the lumen. Then we'll have submucosa, then we'll have muscularis, and then we'll have an outer layer called serosa. And for some organs, it will be adventitia. Serosa will be the organs that are lined by serous membranes. But not all organs are lined by serous membranes. For example, the stomach is retroperitoneal and not lined by a serous membrane. Instead, it's lined by fibrous connective tissue that is known as adventitia. So let's go through these four layers or tunics. Mucosa, again, always lines the lumen. It is going to be made of epithelia. Types are going to include stratified squamous at the mouth, throat, and esophagus as we move food that's really only been chewed up and mixed with saliva and is still relatively abrasive. Once we start in the stomach, we get simple columnar all the way through the large intestine, and then it reverts back to stratified squamous at the anus. Much of that epithelia, especially in the small and large intestine, have goblet cells, and of course those are going to secrete mucus, as we saw back in histology. So because this is an epithelial lining, we are able to secrete along the way mucus, again, from the areas that have goblet cells, digestive enzymes, specifically in the stomach and the small intestine, and hormones along the way, which won't go into the lumen, but will go into the blood supply in the deep to the epithelia in the connective tissue to control digestive processes. This mucosa will also be involved in absorption, moving those molecules, nutrient molecules across the lining into the blood supply. And the stratified squamous epithelia at the mouth and the anus are protective against loss of cells due to abrasion. They do a lot of mitosis with a lot of layers to protect those areas. Deep to the mucosa, so working from the lumen down, is going to be submucosa, which obviously tells us under the mucosa. This is dense connective tissue. It's going to range between areolar and dense irregular connective tissue, depending on where in the alimentary canal you are, but it is primarily dense irregular, which is dense connective tissue. This is the layer that has the blood supply and lymphatic vessels, including structures for immunity called lymphoid follicles, which we'll learn more about later in the semester with the lymphatic system. But they are little clusters of immune tissue that help fight bacteria that are entering the body through the digestive tract. And this is also the layer for the nerve fibers to control digestive function. And of course, this is primarily going to be done by cranial nerve 10, which was vagus, for parasympathetic function. And remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. Deep to that is the muscularis. This muscle is going to vary depending on where in the alimentary canal you are. If you're looking at the layers of the mouth, the pharynx, or the top of the esophagus, it will be skeletal muscle and will perform voluntary swallowing. However, the entire rest of the alimentary canal is going to be smooth muscle, performing peristaltic waves and also segmentation. Along the way, there are strategic thickened rings of smooth muscle called sphincters, and they are going to control the passage of the food along the way. We have a sphincter leading from the esophagus into the stomach, from the stomach into the small intestine, from the small intestine into the large intestine, and finally the anus is the final sphincter that controls the movement of fecal matter to the external environment. And then finally, as I mentioned, the outermost layer will either be visceral peritoneum, known as serosa, also classified as a type of membrane called mesothelium, which we talked about back in histology. Those organs that are not part of a serous membrane system will have adventitia instead, which is protective. Examples include the esophagus and other retroperitoneal organs. Now, the nervous system that infiltrates the digestive structures are known as enteric neurons. Enteric as a word is kind of like using gastric or hepatic, whereas gastric means stomach, hepatic means liver, renal means kidney, enteric means gut. So these are the neurons specifically for operating the alimentary canal or your gut. And they are, again, parasympathetic, part of cranial nerve 10. So starting at the mouth, and we'll work our way through the rest of the alimentary canal, and we'll see some accessory structures along the way. The mouth is known as the oral or buccal cavity. Do you guys remember what buccal means? That's right, cheek. And so between the cheeks is a space known as the oral cavity or mouth. The mouth is responsible for ingestion as well as mechanical digestion for chewing and chemical digestion with saliva. It will also begin propulsion with voluntary swallowing. The mouth is defined by the following boundaries: the lips anteriorly, the cheeks laterally, the palate superiorly, and the tongue inferiorly. And so all the space between those areas is mouth. The opening to the mouth is the oral orifice, oral meaning mouth, orifice and opening. And behind the mouth is the oropharynx. So we're going to see the parts of the pharynx through the rest of the, well, I shouldn't say the rest, through a couple more of the systems, including the respiratory system. So we're going to define the parts of the pharynx before we go on any further. So this would be the nasal cavity behind the nose and the oral cavity behind the mouth. Okay. Those are going to lead into a section that we are calling the pharynx. The pharynx has 3 regions to it. So the region of the pharynx that is directly behind the nasal cavity is nasopharynx. The region behind the oral cavity is oropharynx. And the region that is above the larynx, which is your voice box leading into the trachea, and above the esophagus is called laryngopharynx, for the pharynx above the larynx. So food is meant to travel through 2 of those 3 portions. Food would enter the oral cavity and then enter the oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and then posteriorly into the esophagus, and continue the rest of the way through the alimentary canal. Now, the oral cavity or mouth is lined with stratified squamous epithelia. The food is fairly abrasive, even though we chew it, mix it with saliva. It is also slightly keratinized, but this is not the same thing as the skin. Produces a little bit of keratin for strength, but it doesn't kill the nuclei and other organelles like it does in the skin. So structures that we've learned: the oral cavity is the space that is defined by the palate superiorly, the tongue inferiorly, the lips anteriorly. The cheeks have been removed in the picture, so all of this is mouth or oral cavity. And then the parts of the pharynx. This is the nasal cavity. So you have nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, which is named for being above the larynx. And it is also above the esophagus. So food would continue down into this pipe. Lips and cheeks. The lips and cheeks have a core of skeletal muscles, so they are voluntarily operated. You've learned these muscles, orbicularis oris, all the way around the mouth, and the buccinators in the cheeks. They are going to help make movements for chewing as well as for speech, which isn't a digestive process, but involved in the cheeks and the lips. The lips may not be what you actually think. The lip is the entire fold of tissue that comes away from the mouth. So the part that we typically put, so these are teeth. This is turning out to be a really stupid mouth, but you get the idea. The part that, for example, someone might put lipstick on is actually not your lip. That is called the red margin of the lip. The lip is the entire portion that can come away from the gums. All of that is lip. And so we have a superior and an inferior lip. And it's the entire portion that comes away from the gums, not just the red margin. And the palate is where the second video picks up.